Good evening. I'm Allison Schilling, Senior Program Officer at the Concord Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's forum with Randall Kennedy on his new book, Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. Randall Kennedy is Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulations of race relations. He attended Princeton University, Oxford University, and Yale Law School. Professor Kennedy was awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for Race, Crime, and the Law, and has published 6 other books, including the most recent collection of essays, Say It Loud, the topic of this evening's forum. Our moderator this evening is Tom Putnam, Director of the Concord Museum. Thank you to all of our viewers and museum members for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the program.
Thanks, Allison. And most of all, thank you, Professor Kennedy, for joining us. We're just a few days away from Valentine's, and picking from these essays is a bit like choosing chocolates from a lavish boxed assortment. I highly recommend the book. We're only going to be able to touch upon a few of the essays tonight. I hope you'll all buy it from your local bookstore or take it out from the library. I'll mention I got a bit of flack last week when we did a forum on Phyllis Wheatley and focused more on a recent historical discovery about what had been once described as her lost years when she married a man named John Peters, rather than focusing on her poetry. And I want to remind the audience that we are a history museum. We tend to focus on history. There's a lot of contemporary politics in the book. There's some interesting anecdotes or stories about academia and law schools, but I'm going to focus primarily as a history museum on the essays involving history. The subtitle of the book, again, it's Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. So I will focus on the first 3, the intersection of race, law, and history. Let me note, both in the book and in our conversation tonight, Professor Kennedy does what we try to do here at the museum, which is to use history as a lens by which we see the present and apply the lessons from history to the challenges of our time. I know he'd be the first to say that history isn't prescriptive, that each of us can take different lessons from history. And what we will hear this evening, and if you'll learn if you read from this book, is how he views certain episodes in US history and interprets them in a contemporary context. Let me note again, there's 29 essays in the book. We could easily have a half-an-hour conversation about each one. So I'm going to touch upon 7 or 8. We won't go into too much depth into each. Using my earlier metaphor, I suppose it's a bit like taking a small bite out of a few chocolates rather than just savoring 1 or 2. But I know you're going to learn quite a bit in the next 40 minutes. We welcome your questions in the chat, and then Allison will text those to me. So I thought we might go somewhat chronologically, focusing primarily on the pre-Civil War era to the 1960s, but I will bring up the present on a few matters, including the essay on Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. We've had a few forums here, Professor Kennedy, on John Brown and Frederick Douglass, but during my tenure, we've never discussed Nat Turner. So your essay is titled, Should We Admire Nat Turner? And I'll let you answer that question for us.
Well, thanks so much for affording me this opportunity to talk with you and our colleagues. I'm really glad that you asked me about this, the essay on Nat Turner. I've been going around to bookstores and other settings, and this is the first time I've been asked about the Nat Turner essay. And I was a little bit concerned about the Nat Turner essay. I thought it would be rather controversial, but like I said, this is the first question I've gotten about it. So Nat Turner was an enslaved person in Virginia, and in 1831 he led a slave insurrection, a very bloody slave insurrection. And it was a very consequential slave insurrection because as a result of the Nat Turner Rebellion, Virginia and other slave states really clamped down on free blacks, clamped down on enslaved blacks, made, for instance, the teaching of literacy to slaves a serious crime, increased slave patrols, and such. Now, what's interesting about the essay? The reason why I wrote the essay is because in Black American historiography, Nat Turner is generally viewed as a hero. I mean, you take a look at what W.E.B. Du Bois has written about Nat Turner. You take a look at you just go down the list of African American intellectuals and progressives in general, regardless of their racial status. Nat Turner is generally viewed as a hero. I mean, after all, he struck a blow for freedom. And that's, so what's the issue here? The issue here, there are two big issues. One is a methodological issue. How do we know about Nat Turner?
Mm-hmm.
The way that we know about Nat Turner is through records left by whites. The most famous single document involving the Nat Turner Rebellion is the Confession of Nat Turner. Well, what is the Confession of Nat Turner? The Confession of Nat Turner is a confession, I should say a purported confession, a statement that a white lawyer says was Nat Turner's confession. Now, this lawyer, was no friend of Nat Turner's. He wasn't the counsel for Nat Turner. In fact, the lawyer was, very forthright in saying that he didn't like Nat Turner. He was appalled by Nat Turner. So, question, how much do we trust this confession? How much do we trust the newspaper accounts or the other testimony? So there's a methodological issue, and then there's a substance beneath that. There's a sort of an ethical issue. What do we think of what Nat Turner did? And I'm supposing, let's suppose, I'm willing to, or let me put it different. I'm willing to take as fact the portrayal of Nat Turner's rebellion by the champions of Nat Turner, by the people who love Nat Turner. I'm willing to say, okay, fine. I'm willing to accept your depiction of what happened. And when you take a look at that depiction, the depiction is of a man. He was, deeply religious. He, like I said, he struck a blow for freedom. His champions acknowledge that Nat Turner and his allies, who sort of rallied to his banner, killed women and children. One of the most striking things in the Nat Turner Confession is after the household that where Nat Turner was enslaved, after the adults were killed, they leave that household, and one of Nat Turner's lieutenants says, "Oh, you know what? We forgot the baby." And he turns around, goes back, and slays the baby. So my question is, what does one make of this? And this issue had cropped up a couple of times in classes of mine. I would give to my classes the Nat Turner Confession of Nat Turner. And those classes tended to be very tight. People really didn't want to say very much. And what I ultimately say is, of course, slavery was horrific. I'm no pacifist, so I'm, fully willing, pick up the gun, pick up the sword. If you've got to kill, kill. But it seems to me that if one picks up the sword, if one picks up the gun, one still has it's still required to be disciplined. One cannot engage in just gratuitous violence. And if one does, it seems to me that's an unethical thing for one to do, even if one is enslaved. Now, in class, there would be some students who would get really angry with me and would say, good grief, you're making this demand on people who are enslaved. That's an unfair thing to do. And my response, and it's the response I give in this essay, is, well, hold it. I'm showing respect for the enslaved. You on the other hand, you're not making any ethical demands on the enslaved at all. I am willing to make ethical demands on the enslaved. And so in any event, that's what that essay is about.
And I'll be true to my word and try to be disciplined. So let's move to the next essay. That was beautiful. So the next one, again, somewhat chronologically, Anthony Burns and the terrible relevancy of the Fugitive Slave Act, which, is part of Concord's history. I won't go into that, but tell us again about the trial of Anthony Burns in Boston, who he was. And you used this with the symposium with contemporary federal judges to help them confront the conflict between the law and justice. So tell us about Anthony Burns and the lesson you take from this one.
Anthony Burns was an enslaved man from Virginia who flees slavery, makes it to Boston, and establishes himself within the free Black community. And he makes an error, though. He writes a letter to his brother that's intercepted. And so his slave master knows he's in Boston. His slave master journeys to Boston along with a slave catcher. And they find Anthony Burns and they apprehend him. And they seek to return Anthony Burns back to Virginia using the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And the anti-slavery, the abolitionist forces in Boston rally around Anthony Burns. And they do all sorts of things to try to prevent him from being taken back to Virginia. One, the most dramatic thing that happens is there's a rally at Faneuil Hall, and after the rally, a group goes to the jail and tries to break Anthony Burns out. And in this altercation, a deputy is killed. Batchelder is killed. So there's an attempted breakout. The slave master is sued. There's an effort to buy Anthony Burns, purchase his freedom. There's an effort to defend him as best as he can be defended pursuant, within the bounds of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So all of these things are attempted. They all fail. Anthony Burns is sent back to Virginia. It's very dramatic. You see, there's these drawings that show Anthony Burns walking to the wharf, and he's surrounded by soldiers. Now, as you indicated, I wrote this essay for a very particular audience. I wrote this essay for federal judges. For many years, there's a program at my law school, the Harvard Law School. There's a program in the spring. Federal judges come for 2 or 3 days just for lectures. And so I had this, captive audience of judges. And I've always been interested in the Anthony Burns case. And I thought to myself, gosh, this will be a good audience to grapple with the Anthony Burns case, because what it does is, on the one hand, you have this federal statute, Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which of course now people are disgusted by, people hate it, but it was deemed to be constitutional, deemed to be valid. So here, on the one hand, you have this Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. On the other hand, you have decency, human rights, justice. What are you going to do? And so I would tell the story of Anthony Burns, and then I would say to the judges, okay, we're going to take a little recess. Let's go back to 1854, and let's suppose that you heard of a fugitive slave who had been nabbed in downtown Boston. What would you do? And they get together and they talk, and then we talk about what they would do against the backdrop of Anthony Burns.
And why don't you, as you do in the essay, talk about the terrible relevancy, since it's a case here in Boston, of the contemporary judge?
Yes, well, it's very relevant. In a way, it's always going to be relevant. The tension between law and justice, but I think it's especially relevant with respect to the plight of undocumented people. So we have in our midst people who are fugitives in a way. They're undocumented, deeply vulnerable. Our federal law tells us to do one thing. I think that the inclinations of many people leads them to want to do something else. That clash. Now, a couple of years ago, we had a situation where there was a judge, local judge, who, in fact, I don't know where the proceedings are, but there was a local judge who was prosecuted for violating a federal law, because the allegation was that she attempted to essentially assist an undocumented person to escape from the federal authorities. Now, again, question, what do we think of that? Do we applaud this judge in the way that we might have applauded abolitionists, in the 1850s? Or do we say, that's a lawless judge? What do we do?
I'm going to move us along, and I'm going to skip over one of my questions and go to Woodrow Wilson. So you do a essay on race and the politics of memorialization, and as Allison indicated, you were a graduate of Princeton University, so this is a question that Princeton and other universities, Yale also, where you went to law school, have grappled with, about memorializing presidents or individuals like Calhoun and Woodrow Wilson. So tell us about this essay.
So this is an essay about my alma mater, Princeton University. And at Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton University before he became president of the United States. And Princeton's very proud of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's portraits everywhere. A lot of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton, including the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs. And so a few years ago, there was a student group, Black Justice League, I think was its name, took the position that Princeton ought to demote Woodrow Wilson. In their position, what's with this celebration of Woodrow Wilson? Woodrow Wilson was racist. Woodrow Wilson, when he was president, brought segregation to the federal civil service. They might have added, though they did not. Woodrow Wilson was terrible with respect to the race question. Woodrow Wilson was also terrible with respect to civil liberties. My goodness, what he did during and after World War I was absolutely atrocious. He was one of the great villains in the saga of civil liberties in America. So the student groups said, we want you to take this name down. And there was a sit-in at the president's office, and there was just a lot of discord. And Princeton decided to study this. A committee for the Board of Trustees was created. And to make a long story short, they decided to demote Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson's name was taken off of the School of International Affairs. It's no longer the Woodrow Wilson School. You see a little bit of Woodrow Wilson, but not much, not like it used to be. And so I thought about this, and one of the reasons why this really grabbed me, there were a variety of reasons why it grabbed me, but one reason why it grabbed me was because one of my favorite professors at Princeton was a man by the name of Arthur S. Link. Arthur Link was Woodrow Wilson's biographer. Arthur Link was the editor of the Woodrow Wilson papers. And I took a bunch of courses with Arthur Link. And, I thought I just thought it was an interesting phenomenon. I got the sense sometimes that the student activists, and I tip my hat to them. They certainly did a good job of shaking up the complacency that surrounded the memorialization of Wilson, and that was good. I'm all for that. I did get the sense sometimes, however, that just listening to them, reading some of their material, one got the sense that they believed that they had made, a discovery. One got the sense that that they had discovered that Woodrow Wilson was racist, that they had discovered that Woodrow Wilson helped propel segregation in the federal civil service. Hold it. When I was an undergraduate, I graduated in the class of 77. When I was an undergraduate, we learned about that. It's not like this was not known. The question is, how does one want to respond? Now, again, I applaud the students for shaking up the complacency. I still think I thought it was a close question. What should the university do? And the position I ultimately took I said, frankly, I can live with the demotion of Woodrow Wilson. So if they decide to take his name off, that's perfectly reasonable. Good argument. It's a good argument. In recognition of the bad things that Woodrow Wilson did, in recognition of, our current circumstances, our current attentiveness to the ongoing race problems in America, ongoing racial subjugation in America. We want to lean over backwards to be attentive to that. So yeah, we're going to demote Woodrow Wilson. I think it's a good argument for that. On the other hand, I said, now I could imagine the authorities at Princeton saying, we recognize that there was bad that Woodrow Wilson did, very bad. But we also recognize that Woodrow Wilson was a president of Princeton University, and was not only a president of Princeton University, he was the president of Princeton University who really transformed Princeton University into a first-rate research university. It's true that Woodrow Wilson was racist, and that's deplorable. It's also true that Woodrow Wilson was the president that first facilitated the hiring of Jews at, the Princeton faculty. So it's a complicated thing. So I mean, if Princeton had taken the position we're going to keep his name up, we're going to be more transparent. We want everybody to know about the good along with the bad. My position was I could live with either of those. Let me just say one more thing. I was rather concerned with some of the students when they made statements to the effect that Woodrow, seeing a portrait of Woodrow Wilson or seeing his name up there traumatized them, made them feel really bad, made them feel really unwelcome. And my response to that is, now, we have some control, that we actually have a lot of control over how we respond to our surroundings. And I think it's a very bad thing if a person, as a student at Princeton University, sees a portrait of Woodrow Wilson and is traumatized by that. If that is so, I would say you really need to work on yourself. You really need to do some things so that you don't respond that way. Because first of all, I mean, if you want to change the world, we need people who are not going to be traumatized in order to change the world. We need people who are going to be up and at 'em every day and not, sort of feel depressed, feel badly, feel traumatized. Let me just say one more thing. I said in the past, let's say 30 years at Princeton University, there have been a number of African American professors at Princeton University who are no shrinking violets. The most notable of whom is Cornel West. Actually, I take that back. I mean, Cornel West, very notable, but Toni Morrison may be more notable. Toni Morrison, Cornel West, Valerie Smith, who's now the president of Swarthmore, any number of others. And my question was, these are folks who certainly knew about Woodrow Wilson, but it didn't traumatize them. And it is noteworthy that these people, again, not shrinking violets, did not go on a campaign to demote Woodrow Wilson. So it suggests to me that, one could be a very strong, progressive person, very attuned to racial politics, and coexist with, Woodrow Wilson being a big shot at Princeton University.
I want to move this on, but I heard you in another setting give what you said as a kid or adolescent when you were there, when you looked up and saw the portrait of Woodrow Wilson on the wall.
Yeah, well, I end the essay by just going autobiographical for a moment. I said, listen, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that Woodrow Wilson was alive with us right now and listen to all of this. Now, it's possible that Woodrow Wilson would, in light of all that's happened, in light of, in light of what's all that's happened, would apologize, would say, I was socialized in a certain way. I did the best I could do, but of course I was ignorant of many things. And, not only was I ignorant of many things, but I had vices that were all too common, and I apologized. That's possible. On the other hand, I could also imagine that Woodrow Wilson would, hear all of this and not apologize. And so what I say at the end of my essay, let's imagine that he doesn't apologize. He's there, you see the portrait, no apology. My view was, I'm not going to feel bad. I'm going to look at that portrait. I'm going to look Woodrow Wilson right in the eye. And I'm going to say to Woodrow Wilson, hey, you didn't think that me and my people would be here, did you? And I would laugh. And it seems to me that I would laugh and keep right on stepping. And I guess one of the lessons of that essay is for folks who are activists, definitely shake things up, but for goodness sakes, don't allow yourselves to be infantilized. We need you to conduct a struggle, and to conduct a struggle requires a certain sort of toughness. And you can't be tough, you can't change things if you're going to be traumatized every day. And by the way, the world's a very tough place. You could be traumatized every day.
It's a perfect segue to the next essay I want to talk about, which is titled, How Black Students Brought the Constitution to Campus. Tell us what happened here.
Yeah, in the last few years in particular, there's been a lot of talk about freedom of expression on campuses, and some complain about limits on freedom of expression on campus. And one thing that struck me is that I think that people don't know about what it was that brought the federal Constitution to public campuses. If you say, for instance, students and First Amendment, if you just sort of do a Rorschach test, people immediately will say, oh, Tinker versus Des Moines School District. That was the case in the 1960s involving the high school students who they were told to take off their armband. They were protesting the Vietnam War, and the principal says, "Take off your armband or go home." And the students don't take off their armbands, so they're sent home. The students sue. This case goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. Supreme Court of the United States says, well, so long as nothing was being disrupted, so long as the educational program at the school was not being disrupted, the students should be able to wear their armband. You don't surrender your First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gates. That's what law, that's you take con law in law school. That's what you read. That's what you know about. All right. Well, fine. You should know that. But if you read the Tinker case, you see that the Supreme Court, when the opinion's written, they refer to earlier cases. And they basically are validating these earlier cases. Well, what are those earlier cases? What was going on there? What was going on there were cases in the early 1960s, cases from the Deep South, cases in which Black students were being disciplined for protesting against various sorts of racial injustice. And there are two key cases. One is a case that's sort of the Fountainhead case, the case that actually begins the idea of students having First Amendment rights, is a case called St. John Dixon versus Alabama Board of Education. It's a case involving Black students at Alabama State College, historically Black college. These students protested, they engaged in a sit-in. They sat in at a restaurant that was in a courthouse of all places, a segregated restaurant in a courthouse. These students sit in. The governor of the state learns of the sit-in and learns that these students are at Alabama State College. So the governor of the state calls the president of Alabama State College and basically says, I want you to do something. I want you to discipline these students. And what ultimately happens is the president basically says to these students, you're expelled. They just get a letter, you're expelled. No hearing, no nothing. You are expelled. By tomorrow, I want you to be gone. Well, at that point, at that time, the law was very decidedly on the side of the authorities. Students were viewed as having no federal constitutional rights. The sort of the basic idea was, well, of course you have a right to speak, but you don't have a right to be a student at such and such a place. So speak all you want, but if the school wants to get rid of you, the school can get rid of you. There was a very good district court judge who presided over the case, Frank Johnson, legendary judge, good judge. He decided in favor of the state. He said, students don't have First Amendment rights. The case was appealed, and an appellate court said, you know what? Students have to have some right. I mean, at least they have to have a right to a hearing. I mean, people who were charged with all sorts, you can be charged with all sorts of things. Everybody, you have to have a hearing. I mean, maybe somebody made an error in terms of identifying a student. You got to have a hearing at least. That was the beginning. That's case number one. By the way, these students, there were 9 students who were expelled. They won their case ultimately in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. None of the students, however, went back to that college, though decades later they were all accorded honorary degrees. There's a second case. Second case involves high school students, Mississippi High School. Black students go to school with a button on. What is the button? The button says SNCC. What does that stand for? Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it also, this buttons also had one man, one vote. They go to school with this button on. The principal says to these students, I'm going to give you a choice. You can take the button off. And if you take the button off, fine. You can go on about your business here at the school. Or you can leave the button on, but if you leave the button on, you got to leave, you got to go. Students, a bunch of the students who have the buttons on leave. They get lawyers, and their lawyers prevail ultimately, using the same theory that the Supreme Court later used in the Tinker case. But the point I wanted to make was that it was Black students in the Deep South fighting for racial justice who actually had waged struggles that all students now benefit from.
I'm running low on time, but let's talk about Thurgood Marshall, who you clerked for. Tell us a little bit about that essay and about your experience with Justice Marshall, and then we'll end with your impressions of his successor, Clarence Thomas. But start with Thurgood Marshall.
Well, yeah, one of the longest essays in the book is a profile of Thurgood Marshall. It's one of the essays that I most enjoyed writing. Why? Because working for Thurgood Marshall in the 1983-84 Supreme Court term was one of the highlights of my life. Working for Thurgood Marshall was just an absolutely delightful experience. For a year, I got to go in to work and most days talk with Mr. Civil Rights, the greatest lawyer in the history of the United States. For a year, I got to talk with Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall, every day, just constantly. And it was just great. And I wanted to talk about Thurgood Marshall, and I just made a claim, strong claim. I just called Thurgood Marshall the greatest lawyer in the history of the United States. I'm prepared to argue that proposition. I would definitely argue that proposition. I mean, here was a person who, you just take a look at his wealth of experience. Private attorney who represented people doing, torts cases, contracts cases, divorce cases, libel cases, murder cases, rape cases. The leading lawyer for the NAACP over a quarter century, where he is involved in the major race relations law cases that undergirded the Second Reconstruction. I once asked Thurgood Marshall, in fact, he had a cookout at his house. I go to the cookout, and I go into his basement. And in his basement, he had bookshelves where he had these leather-bound briefs, all of his briefs that he had argued in the cases he had argued at Supreme Court, leather-bound briefs. He comes in, and just to make conversation, I say to Justice Marshall, Justice Marshall, which of these was your, of which case makes you the most proud of your performance? I thought, of course, for sure he was going to say Brown versus Board of Education. I mean, I thought this was just a setup. Nope. He did not say Brown versus Board of Education. He said that the appellate argument about which he was most proud was a case called Smith versus Allwright, decided in 1944. It was a case that invalidated the white primary in Texas. In Texas, prior to Smith versus Allwright, Black people could not participate in the Democratic Party primary. And he put it in, Marshall's case put it into that. And then later, another Marshall case put it into the same practice in South Carolina, which is my home state. But I mean, so, he argues all these important cases. He is a Court of Appeals judge. He is the Solicitor General of the United States. He just does so many different things. And I try to, as vividly as I possibly can, I try to just show the greatness of Thurgood Marshall in that profile.
I haven't asked you any questions that allow you to talk more biographically, but talk a little bit about your father and your father having watched a case that Mrs. Marshall.
Yes. So one of the reasons, I grew up in a household in which the name Thurgood Marshall was a familiar presence, and it was largely because of my father. My father worked in the post office, and my parents were refugees from the Jim Crow South. They left Columbia, South Carolina when I was quite young. That's why I grew up in Washington, D.C. They fled Jim Crow. Before they fled Jim Crow, however, my father watched Thurgood Marshall argue a case in Columbia, South Carolina. The name of the case was Rice versus Elmore. It was a case in which George Elmore, Black man, owned a couple of grocery stores, owned some cabs. George Elmore wanted to vote in the Democratic Party primary. And he was told, no, you can't vote. Black people are not allowed to vote. The Democratic Party primary is like a private club. You can't vote. Elmore sued. He had a good lawyer on his side, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall argued the case, and my father went to see the argument. Now, like I said, my father was not an attorney. He didn't pay much attention to the main legal issue. The main legal issue in the case was a state action doctrine. He didn't pay attention to that. What mattered to my father was what the judges and other people in that courthouse called Thurgood Marshall. That's the thing he talked about over and over and over again. They called Thurgood Marshall Mr. Marshall. Now you might ask yourself, well, what? What's the big deal? The big deal was this was 1948 Columbia, South Carolina. This was a situation in which, under Jim Crow etiquette, white people did not typically call Black men Mr. anything. You might call a Black minister Reverend. You might call a Black physician doctor. But other than that, Black men were called by their first names, or they were referred to as just boy. But they called Thurgood Marshall Mr. Marshall. And my father said it was quite apparent that in that courtroom, the dominant figure, everybody recognized who the dominant figure in that courtroom was, and it was Thurgood Marshall. And my father talked about how uplifting, how inspiriting, how inspiring that was. On the next to last day that I worked for Thurgood Marshall, I had my father come to the courthouse, Supreme Court of the United States. And I was a little bit concerned because Justice Marshall was a very moody guy. He was a tough guy. And I was wondering how, how he was going to receive my father. Thurgood Marshall was completely gracious, was wonderful. And it really meant a lot to me how gracious he was. And my father said to Thurgood Marshall, he said, I saw you argue Rice versus Elmore. Oh no, Elmore versus Rice. I thought you argue Elmore versus Rice. I have never forgotten it. And I want you to know, sir, what people in the Deep South used to say. And he said, when things were really going badly and some terrible racial miscarriage of justice had occurred, Black people would say, hold on, Thurgood's coming. And I must say, I just found it so moving that after such a long time, my father, was in a position to say that to Thurgood Marshall, and they shook hands, and it was definitely one of the most poignant moments of that year that I spent with Thurgood Marshall.
I almost want to end there. You wish you could freeze history sometimes, but I have to ask you about your essay, Why Clarence Thomas Ought to Be Ostracized.
I'm going to be quick about this. Thurgood Marshall was a great champion for social justice, not only racial justice, gender justice. He was a great champion of freedom of expression. He was one of the great progressives in the history of the United States. And it is really a tragic thing that he was succeeded by a person who has shown himself to be a reactionary justice and whose views are so antithetical to the generous, progressive views of Thurgood Marshall. And so in this essay, I set forth my critique of Justice Thomas, and I indicate my view that Justice Thomas ought to be very harshly criticized to the point of being ostracized. And the thing that really cut it with me was Justice Thomas's vote in one of the real judicial delinquencies of our era, Shelby County versus Holder, the case in which the Supreme Court of the United States eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the most effective piece of civil rights legislation to arise from the Second Reconstruction. So that was my essay on Justice Thomas.
I won't quote directly, but you have a line, something about if you don't use the term sellout to describe Clarence Thomas, then the term has no utility.
Well, you did a very good, that's exactly what I meant to say, and I stand by that.
So we only have one question, then I'll give you a final question for myself. So this questioner is asking about this term race. Some people don't prefer not to use it because they think it reinforces something that doesn't actually exist. We had a Jacqueline Jones, a very prominent historian, wrote a wonderful book about African-American women. I gave her the title, kind of race in American history. She said, no, I don't want to use the term race. She ignores it. How do you grapple with that overall question?
Race, very vexed word. I understand the argument that, race is a is a myth. It's something that we have created, and there's an argument. Let's attack the idea of race by burying the term and the idea behind it. Okay, I understand that. That's not the way I go. I'm willing. Sure, it's a myth. It's a myth, however, that's believed in by millions and millions and millions of people. And so it's got this force to it. And so even if it doesn't really exist, in the minds of millions of people, it exists. And therefore, it's a social phenomenon with which we have to grapple. That's sort of my stance.
We just have a couple minutes left, so we can't cover that beautiful first essay. But why don't we go towards the end of that essay where you describe the essay is about racial optimism and pessimism, about are we going to reach the promised land? And why don't you end with where you land on that question and how that your views have changed some about.
Yes, so that's the opening essay in the book. And basically what I say is in commentary about race relations in America, you can divide the commentary up usefully into two camps. One camp says we shall not overcome our history of racial strife. It's a very interesting camp. Alexis de Tocqueville would be in that camp. Thomas Jefferson would be in that camp. Abraham Lincoln would be in that camp. Elijah Muhammad would be in that camp. Malcolm X would be in that camp. My colleague Derek Bell would be in that camp. The pessimistic camp. We shall not overcome, alas.
Your father was in that.
And my father would be in that camp. That's right. My father would be in that camp. And unfortunately, it's not like there's not reason. It's not like the people are just making up things. There's reason for people to be in that camp. Tragic reason. On the other hand, there is an optimistic camp. In the 19th century, the great voice of optimism would have been Frederick Douglass. In the 20th century, I think the great voice of optimism was the great Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream, August 1963, or April 1968, I've been to the mountaintop. I might not get there with you, but I've glimpsed the promised land. Now for me, in the 21st century, the most consequential voice in the optimistic tradition would be Barack Obama. Yes, we can. I have been, for all of my adult life, an optimist. For most of my adult life, I've been a very I've been a strong optimist. I've been a confident optimist. I'm still an optimist, but I'm chastened. The last few years, particularly the ascendancy of Donald Trump to the White House, has shaken me. I'm still an optimist, but I have to admit that my optimism has been shaken. And that initial essay is about those two camps and my own grappling with those two camps.
Well, it's a perfect way to end. I'm going to actually read the final words of the book, although I'm going to tighten them a little bit, where you write, maybe it is prudent to forswear strict allegiance to any grand blueprint that would seek to master our unruly racial reality. Maybe the best that can safely be managed are smaller, though significant, interstitial goals that are attentive to the pluralism that infuses American practices, yearning for racial promised lands alongside pragmatic acceptance of decent compromises. Professor Randall Kennedy, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It was a fascinating hour. Again, I highly recommend the book to those of you who joined us. And I'm sure on behalf of Professor Kennedy, we thank you for spending the last hour with us.
Thank you.